You don't get over grief. It doesn't go away, but some people have referred to it as it gets lighter. You can find joy again, but you have to sit in the muck, as I called it, the messiness of grief. And it's painful and unbearable at times. But I believe it's best not to do grief in isolation.
Hello and welcome to Chat CTK, a podcast exploring life and faith at Christ the King Catholic Church in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm your host, John Stotts, Director of Adult Faith Formation here at CTK. In episode 2 of our second season, I talk with Christ the King's Pastoral Care Coordinator, Margaret Emsweller. We discuss the parish's grief ministry, its resources for those who have lost loved ones, and she talks about her own journey through grief. I'll offer a content warning for our listeners. We do discuss pregnancy loss, the loss of adult children, and the loss of spouses. If you are in need of support during a difficult time, you can find Margaret's contact information on our website, ctk.org. All right, well, thank you for being here today to talk a little bit about your ministry and yourself. I'm hoping that maybe there are people listening to this who weren't aware of some of the resources that Christ the King offers, and that this will be a resource for them whenever they need it, whether that's now or later. But maybe we could start. Could you share just a little bit about your role as the pastoral care coordinator here, and maybe more specifically your involvement with the grief ministry in our parish?
Right. I primarily serve the senior population, train ministers to go and visit, bring them communion. We have communion services in 3 different senior facilities. And then I do help families plan funerals for their loved ones after they've died. And we have also a grief support group for those who have suffered a loss and would like to come together with their faith community to work their way through grief.
In a parish this size, I would imagine you're pretty busy most of the time. What inspired you to work in grief ministry and to make it your goal to support those who are going through some of the most difficult times I think any of us can imagine going through?
I think over the years it kind of evolved because I had suffered grief myself. I suffered the loss of a child early in pregnancy on Christmas Eve one year. I lost my son at age 26. And I lost my husband. He died in 2012. And in a span of 7 years, I lost 4 significant loved ones. So you have to go through this process, this messy process of grief, which is just overwhelming and debilitating. But you have to work through it in order to live again. And it's messy, but once you go through the process and don't run from it, but deal with it, then your hope is to remember all those loved ones with more love than pain.
But maybe there's still some pain.
You don't get over grief. It doesn't go away. But some people have referred to it as it gets lighter. You can find joy again. But you have to sit in the muck, as I called it, the messiness of grief. And it's painful and unbearable at times. But I believe it's best not to do grief in isolation. You need support. You need someone who will listen. And everyone grieves differently. No one grieves the same. But some people will do better with a grief counselor or a trusted friend who they can spill their heart out to. And some do better with a grief support group, those who are going through the same pain in a place where they can feel safe to share. And people mean well when when one of your friends dies or you're trying to console someone, but sometimes things that they say are not quite helpful, or not always helpful. So I would suggest just listening. And I often share this quote from Parker Palmer. And in it, he said, the human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It just wants to be witnessed just as it is. And the same applies to grief. You need to be allowed to express those feelings of grief, whatever they are, and not be afraid of the grief. I call it sitting with the pain. Don't be at war with the grief. It will be a series of contractions where you're inward and in deep despair, and then comes an expansion where you'll have some relief. And it's kind of like a roller coaster. You have one day you're up and you're feeling a little bit better, and then the next day you're back down into the midst of the contracted grief where you're very inward and in unbearable pain.
It sounds like maybe one of the benefits of finding a way to process grief, whether it's with a group at a church or with a counselor or whatever it is, maybe it increases the interval between those contractions and those expansions over time. Because I imagine they're probably more frequent the closer you are to the source of the grief. But go ahead.
No, and then over time, when you deal with the stages of grief that we refer to, going through that bargaining, sometimes there's great guilt, and you need to work through that and all the what ifs. What if I had done this? What if I had been there? What if? And over the course of time, you come to the conclusion of, even if I had been there, maybe my loved one probably would have died anyway. Working through grief is very difficult. Sometimes there is anger associated with grief. I know initially the shock of grief. I remember waking up the day after my son died and thinking, oh, this is just a bad dream. I really thought for a moment I was holding on. Maybe this is a bad dream. I also, after losing the baby early in pregnancy, I had a difficult time sleeping, and I was going into the bedrooms where my children were sleeping and just kind of checking on them, It's kind of like waiting for the next shoe to fall, or fear that something else I would lose, have another loss, which during grief you're not thinking logically. I call it the robot brain, robot. You're going through the motions, but you don't feel like your head is connected to your body. Nothing is making a lot of sense. You're in a fog.
every loss seems so different. Especially losing a pregnancy, it can be such a hidden loss. It's not like some losses that are very public where people know, but there can be pressure not to share too much, or even to not grieve, which I think can be particularly harmful for women who have suffered, and any parents who have suffered loss of a pregnancy. And it's, I think, far more common than we realize.
Yes. And with the loss of a child early in a pregnancy, it's not only the death of that child, but it's the death of expectations for a life with this child that you'll never truly know.
Are such parents welcome in the grief groups that you run, or are those groups primarily for people who have lost older children or spouses? Is this open to anyone?
We have people in there who have lost parents, who've lost a significant a partner, a best friend, a child, a spouse. Grief is not the same for everyone, but they do share the pain of loss. And their sharing with each other truly helps them work through this process of loss.
What is it like to share loss with others who have also experienced loss, but loss that isn't the same as yours? I mean, it seems to me that part of me would want someone to understand, to have been in my shoes, but maybe another part of me knows that no one could ever understand my own experience.
Not definitively understanding your experience, but there's such empathy for your pain, I believe. And you're there because you've lost the death of a very dear loved one, regardless of whether it was a friend or a child or a spouse. So you have that in common. And that is very helpful for others. Some people come into the group and can't feel uncomfortable sharing immediately, and they learn so much from other people sharing. It's funny how you can think of something from what someone else has said and apply it to your own life and your own situation, and it is helpful and comforting.
How do you see faith playing a role in the grieving process?
My faith, I don't know how I would have been able to make it through without my faith. And I hear this in our grief group over and over. How do people do this without their faith? I remember after the loss of my son, just basically doubled over in pain, just praying, God, I can't do this. I can't do this alone. You got to help me. And just pouring out my heart. The pain is so excruciating and heavy. And he did. I mean, I have to tell you, and it's kind of a funny story, but after Chris died, the family was together watching an old movie. I'd never seen it before. It's called True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis. And there's this scene in the movie where Jamie Lee had been kidnapped by these Russian spies, and here comes Arnold Schwarzenegger in a helicopter, lowering this hoist and grabbing her through the opening of the car she was in, and he hoists her out of that and lifts her up in the air, and they pan out, and you see her just dangling, holding on to dear life, being carried over the sea, these turbulent waves, and until she is put down safely on dry land. And it occurred to me, that's me. That's me. I'm just holding on right now for dear life. And but Arnold Schwarzenegger, wasn't the pilot, or the of my helicopter. Yeah. God was.
You mentioned earlier that anger can play a role in the grieving process. Do you find that people grow angry at God sometimes?
Sometimes people are angry at God, and what you want to do is get those emotions out, and God can take it. He understands. And you may be angry at the person who died. Nothing's logical. Yeah. It's all irrational. Yeah. And you just have to go with it, and you have to do the work. You have to work through this. No one can do it for you, but you can be supported through it. And so yes, you can be angry at God. You can bargain. What if I'd done this? What if I had done that? And you hope that you can turn it around to eventually say, even if. You want to work your way through grief so you get to a point of acceptance. And that takes a while. There's no time limit to grief, and it takes as long as it takes. It's not linear. You may jump into one stage and then back to another stage and then again. But hopefully you get to the acceptance that this is my life now. And then David Kessler, who is kind of an authority on grief, has written a book on meaning, the meaning after the acceptance. What is the meaning? And it's not, it's the meaning of who you are now as a result of what you've gone through. And for some people, I was drawn to grief ministry. Started off just presenting books to people after I was hired here at Christ the King. And then, it kind of evolved into the grief group. And so a year after I was hired, we started our first grief group in 2017. So for me, it was who am I now after suffering these losses, and can I give back to someone else who's experiencing loss? Can I support them? And so the grief group, or working with people who are planning a funeral liturgy. I know that pain. I've experienced that pain. So, I feel God led me in this direction because I kind of know the subject matter.
Yeah. If I were grieving a recent loss and reached out and decided to attend my first grief group, what could I expect from that meeting? What does it look like?
We the first thing I do is assure people that what stays in this room, anything that's shared will stay in this room. People need to feel safe and comfortable. And I don't tell them they have to share. They don't have to share, and often people aren't comfortable sharing initially. There's always usually an extrovert in the group that will start the ball rolling, so to speak. But no, it is about being comfortable and safe and being with people who will respect you and that you can share your story with. So that's how, and we present material. Mary Lou O'Gorman assists in facilitating the group with me, and together we kind of guide people through a topic for the day, and then have some reflection questions. And we ask for people to share, but if they don't feel comfortable, there's no pressure put on them. And then it kind of evolves.
What are some of the topics that you might talk about?
Well, we go through the stages of grief. We go through the difficulties they might be having. We have them name their emotions so they can talk about those, what they're feeling, and help them there. If I give a lot of handouts too, things to take home and reflect on, something on guilt, something on the manifestations of grief. So I unfortunately, I feel like I'm cutting down a lot of trees, but I think it's important that you can't grasp everything that you hear in an hour and a half. You need to go home and absorb some of it again.
Have you seen these groups bearing fruit? Is this helpful to people?
Yes, we even have a group now that after they were finished with this initial grief support group, they decided we don't want to stop. And so we now have a Journeys group that's led by one of our parishioners, and they meet every couple of weeks. Oh. They have bonded so. This club that no one else really ever wants to be a part of, but they have formed such a bond and such a community of support. And it's so beautiful to do grief support here at Christ the King or in any church where you can share your faith and know that God is such a part of this journey with you.
What would you like this ministry to look like in 5 or 10 years if it were to continue to grow and develop and you could, rub a bottle and get a genie to grant you 3 wishes, however you want to think about it?
Oh, wow. I haven't thought about that. That we would have opportunities to have more sessions of grief. That there would be more after sessions, that these small faith communities, that they really are small faith communities, that they would continue and help other people in the community as well.
I'm thinking about the Beatitudes, which, as we're recording this, we're in the midst of Father Decter's Lenten retreat. Blessed are those who mourn. Maybe a better translation of that could be blessed are those who grieve, for they will be comforted. And it sounds like one of the ways in which you and others are experiencing comfort in the midst of grief is through these connections that people are making, that they wouldn't otherwise have made. It's powerful. And I think, too, of the very nature of the Christian story, sort of rooted in grief. The cross, a mother grieving, imagining Mary going through these contractions and expansions. And sometimes I think we imagine that the resurrection sort of wipes it all away, but I'm not always sure, that you can go through a death like that. I'm thinking again of Mary witnessing what happens to her son I'm not sure you get over it, as you've said, and it's interesting to think of Mary continuing to carry that grief.
You carry it, but you found a new, who are you now? You move forward. You don't stay in that grief, that initial grief. You move forward, and you really apply your grief, your story, to who you become as a result of experiencing this grief. And don't they say the most growth comes from a difficulty? Mm-hmm. And that certainly can be said of grief. And most people, and we do mention this often, that sometimes if you find something that you can do for someone else, it helps you in your grief if you're helping someone else in some small way. It doesn't have to be grand. You don't have to run and get a job in the parish and start a grief group, but you can, anything that you can do to help someone else, because I think there's a greater awareness and appreciation for life and the precious, how life is fragile and precious. And you can take that with you and help someone else. One of the most beautiful liturgies for me is on All Souls Day, the Mass of Remembrance. And we have the faith community, many people in our faith community come together, and during the liturgy, people process forward and light a candle in remembrance of their loved one. And I remember one year just becoming so overwhelmed with the spirit, this love of this faith community coming together in their pain, holding on to their faith and worshiping together. That, to me, that's truly the body of Christ.
Well, as we bring this conversation to a close, is there anything else that you want to share if someone's listening who may be suffering grief and unsure what to do next? Are there any words that you would have for them?
Reach out. Try not to grieve in isolation. You really need to share. Grief needs to be shared. It needs to be witnessed and heard. So find some way, either a friend, a counselor, a grief group, but reach out.
Thanks so much for sharing your time with us today.
Certainly.
Thank you for listening to Chat CTK, a podcast exploring life and faith at Christ the King Catholic Church. This podcast is written, directed, and recorded by John Stotts. CTK parishioner Brian Steinberg graciously donates his time to edit and produce the podcast. You can find new episodes at ctk.org/chatctk, or you can subscribe to it using Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app.